Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Thought Leadership webinar. Today's topic is supporting high performance in remote teams. My name is Adrian. I'm a principal consultant and psychologist here at PBC. So I just want to extend a really warm welcome to everybody that is joining us this afternoon. Hopefully you've got some lunch or something to munch on while you attend today, and obviously hope that everybody is staying well and healthy. So like I said, today's webinar is really a thought leadership piece, and really what we wanted to do is talk a little bit more about how you can best support your remote teams and what strategies will make sense in terms of being able to do that effectively. So in terms of the agenda for today, really we'll talk about what a remote working team is, what are they, how are they different from perhaps your traditional teams. We'll also talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that both leaders and members of remote working teams may face. We'll talk about as well some of the characteristics of a high performing team, and then finally talk a bit more about strategies in terms of how to best support your team's performance, especially as there's been a move to a lot of your team working from home. So just a little bit of a thought bubble to begin today's webinar. Really, this came from an interview with Kate Lister, president of Global Workplace Analytics based in the United States, and she said, at the moment, this is the tipping point for remote work, and I tend to agree. I think a lot of organizations and leaders up until this point have let remote work happen to them, have let remote work happen on an ad hoc basis rather than being really proactive in driving a remote working workforce. And so really today is, well, now with a change in climate, a change in working dynamic, how can we be a bit more proactive in better supporting our team members as they are working from various locations? You know, if you look at some of the research out there and some of the recent surveys, up until this point, you know, close to about 50% or so of the global workforce do work from home in one way, shape or form on at least a part-time basis. So there was already a majority of individuals and teams working remotely at least a few days a week. Obviously, with today's climate, that's changed quite significantly, and so you're probably going to see much larger numbers. So this is a little bit of a no-brainer, but what are the differences between a remote team and or remote virtual team versus a face-to-face team? Spatial distance is obviously the first change or difference. Traditional face-to-face teams really being in close physical proximity. Some of the terminology there perhaps co-located. When you look at remote and virtual teams, there's obviously a very physical separation there. The second primary difference in terms of the physicality of the two different types of teams is the communication media. So with traditional face-to-face teams, obviously there's a face-to-face component there. You're interacting with those people in a face-to-face manner. Remote and virtual teams are heavily reliant on technology. So obviously hygiene factors there around technology is going to be really important. But yes, obvious, yes, a no-brainer, but still worth mentioning, especially as we start to really define the differences between the two. So I want to introduce our first big idea of this afternoon. And the idea here is that essentially the underlying characteristics of a high-performing team remain exactly the same characteristics, whether they are a virtual remote team or a traditional team. So the underlying characteristics of what defines high performance in a team are exactly the same in virtual versus traditional teams. The main difference here is that the way in which the team and the way in which the individuals demonstrate these characteristics in a virtual environment is going to look a little bit different. So likewise, the characteristics of a high-performing team are the same across virtual and traditional. So the dysfunctions and the likely dysfunctions and the potential red flags in both of those teams are also going to be quite similar. So adapted from Patrick Lencioni's work around dysfunctions of a team, and most of you are likely to be very familiar with this, but you've got there at the base of all of it an absence of trust, right? And so it's this unwillingness to be vulnerable, and that becomes obviously a lot more challenging in a virtual environment. The second dysfunction, that fear of conflict, so maybe more veiled discussions, less open commentary and feedback, maybe some guardedness there. Then the lack of commitment, not necessarily buying into a team's decisions or the leader of that team's decisions. Followed then by the absence of accountability, hesitant to call people out on their actions or poor behavior or underperformance. And then finally, that inattention to results, so individuals placing their own needs above the team outcomes and the team results. So again, these core underlying potential red flags or dysfunctions that work against performance in a team are likely to exist in those traditional senses, in those face-to-face instances, but absolutely in a virtual and remote environment. I'll pause there. In terms of any questions that you might have throughout the webinar today, we've got a chat function there, and our moderator Jaja will be collating some of your questions throughout this afternoon. So please absolutely feel free along the way to write any questions as they come up, any reflections as they come up throughout the presentation, and we'll spend a little bit of time later after the presentation answering or addressing some of those questions. Now, I don't promise to have all of the answers to the questions, but I think let's create a space to talk them through. So in terms of the characteristics of a high-performing team, what does that actually look like? Really, if you think about it, there are two key pillars here, and it comes down to performance, which are the characteristics that impact on the capability of the team to achieve the deliverables and results that they are responsible for. So what are the characteristics that are impacting that team's ability to deliver results? The second pillar has to do with culture. And the way that we define culture here is that it's the characteristics that impact on the team's standards of behavior, the values that influence how they work together and achieve those objectives. It's how they work. It's that consensus. It's that understanding of the way we work in the team. So performance and culture, results and behavior. As we get a little bit more specific, you'll see here on the right-hand side our model of what a high-performing team looks like in terms of those specific characteristics. Now, these 12 characteristics across the two dimensions are driven by a lot of the research that we've done looking at, well, what are those factors driving performance in teams? So you can see there under the performance model, things like strategy, having a clear strategy, being innovative, holding people accountable. We saw that mentioned in Lencioni's model. Readiness for change and getting those results, as well as having those really effective meetings, all leading to getting those results that are required. From a cultural element, it really is about forming those trusted relationships, being able to manage conflict appropriately, communicating clearly, having that emotional intelligence to be able to effectively manage relationships, collaborating effectively, and then at the end there, and last but not least, that resilience component. And so whilst we have a whole range of different factors here, consider this: your high-performing teams up until this point may be typically demonstrating a lot of these characteristics. A lot of these things are being very evident in the way that they work, in the way that they function from a performance and a cultural perspective. But at this point in time, especially as a move into the remote or virtual environment, you may find that some of these components are going to be more impacted than others. So whilst they're all important, think about the characteristics that are most likely to be impacted due to a change in working dynamic. So which ones are the ones that are going to be impacted the most? And I think we can all agree, and when we look at the research and comb the research around virtual teams and some of the challenges facing leaders and facing members of the team, trust comes up time and time again. It was one of the dysfunctions and the first underlying and most impactful dysfunction of a team potentially, and we see it here as such a core component of driving that performance. So trust, what happens when we move to a virtual environment? So some of the research suggests that trust becomes diminished. So that lack of direct visibility around what others are doing can impact that trust. And I'm not necessarily just talking about, leaders, managers, or team members who have a reputation of being micromanagers. I'm really talking about some of those little nuances, being able to look across your shoulder or scan the environment that you're in and see, what's everybody working on? What are they doing here? That presence is not always going to be available in a virtual environment. The next piece here around trust is, now more than ever, there's an increased need and effort for leaders to really build and maintain these trusted relationships in their teams. It's always been such an important factor. It just means that now there's so much more discretionary effort and focus required from leaders, and so it's going to require a lot of attention to keep this afloat. The second thing that is probably the most impacted by the move to virtual environments is communication. So in a virtual environment or a remote environment, the relational links are a lot weaker. So it becomes a lot more challenging to navigate social emotional processes, right? Relationship building, cohesion, trust, some of the things that we take for granted that we get through those face-to-face interactions. If anybody's used technology in trying to communicate or has communicated or has already worked in a remote team, sometimes that gap in communication, that time lag between an email, even the lag that you might see in a video conference or a phone call, those little gaps can sometimes mean that people are going to fill that void with certain assumptions. So if certain things are not communicated in a more traditional way, at the speed of more traditional communication, then people are naturally going to fill in the gaps for themselves, and that can sometimes lead to incorrect assumptions, and that can potentially then flow on to things like conflict. The third point here is that reliance on technology. So at the end of the day, hygiene factors around technology is so important, and the minute that technology lets us down is the moment that communications then are halted. So there's a severe impact just in terms of that move from face-to-face to remote. And then you've got cultural differences, and this has always existed in teams that have operated virtually or remotely. Teams that operate in a more global dynamic, and those time differences, those cultural differences and understandings then those challenges get more exacerbated as the virtual environment becomes the platform for those communications. So understanding the needs of different team members, understanding the way that they work culturally is going to be a lot more challenging as well. So trust, communication, and I would say these are the two most impacted by the move to remote situations. Now, if you've looked here and mapped it back to the model that we have here around a high-performing team, you'll see there that these two are very much embedded in the cultural element, the way we do work. If we look at some of the other things that are impacting virtual remote teams, strategy, I think, is a really, really big one. I choose to speak about strategy because I think as we look at the way that we've been working, We look at the decisions that are being made in organizations, in government. The strategies are now more moving to direct firefighting, and very rightly so. I think there's a lot at the moment that is causing leaders and organizations to really fight those tactical fires and get those pieces in place and their ducks in a row before they even start thinking about third horizon goals. So having an understanding around the immediate future and direction of the business is going to be so important, and by extension the part that the team plays within that future direction is also going to be so critical as well, and a lot of that at the moment I think is in flux. And like I mentioned, those shorter term strategies are now being prioritized over longer term horizon objectives. So it's the challenge here and the impact is, well, what am I coming in for? How does my work connect to the broader strategy of the business? And again, the research is in strong support of the need to have a really strong strategy, and that communicated from leaders and from the top. Even at an individual level, when we think about engagement, the more connected an individual feels they are to the strategy of their team, their department, and the organization, the stronger their levels of engagement. The accountability piece, immediate real-time feedback. This is so impacted by the way that we're working now. You can't swivel your chair and give somebody some feedback on something you observe. It's less likely to walk out of a meeting and grab somebody for a couple of seconds and provide them with some constructive feedback in terms of what was observed. And in all reality, the accountability piece has been something that has been the most challenging aspects for teams in general, traditional teams, face-to-face teams. When we look at our own research around high-performing teams, even the highest performing teams have things like accountability as some of their lower effective characteristics. So this just becomes a lot more exacerbated, especially because of the distance. So by no means are these four the only things that are going to be impacted by the move to remote or virtual environments. But I think if we focus on the 3 or 4 things, they would probably be the ones that the research has suggested of having the broadest impact. What you will also notice if you consider the model is that whilst all 12 of these things are really important for any sort of functioning team, they are interrelated. So your performance is not independent of culture, and even the characteristics within culture and performance are going to be interrelated as well. So our second big idea of this afternoon is, as your teams move to remote ways of working, their capacity to demonstrate the characteristics of a high-performing team are likely to have changed. So the capacity of them to demonstrate these characteristics that they usually may have been able to has and potentially will change. So let's take an example. So consider the following characteristics of your team. So if you think about your immediate team or even the team of clients that you work with, consider the following. The existence of effective exchange of views and opinions from all team members when there are important issues. What is there a high level of open and honest communication across the team? Traditionally, have the team members kept each other informed around important issues affecting their areas of responsibility? Up until this point, has the team made that time to celebrate success and milestones? And has your team been able to make time for some of those more social interactions that build those really core personal relationships? So the question here, how has moving to a remote working environment actually influenced how well your team actually does these things when it comes to communication? So obviously social interactions are changed enormously due to social distancing policies. How often are we able to celebrate those successes in those virtual environments, make that time and then apply that concerted effort to make sure that we're doing that? How informed are your team members now of what each other's roles and responsibilities are? So up until this point, yeah, great, we're working together, we have our morning huddles face to face, or we're catching each other in the corridor, or we're having some of those ongoing conversations, we're keeping each other in the loop and we're communicating effectively. But that whole landscape has changed now. So have we, as a result, changed as a team with regards to that? So here are some tips. How do you support your teams? Have reliable tools first, establish structured daily check-ins, set clear expectations, trust your team, and do 101 other things that you will have probably looked at on Google before you joined today's webinar. And I'm not discounting any of these tips. In fact, a lot of these are very practical. A lot of them are going to be very valid strategies and tips for supporting your remote teams. But before you get into action mode, before you get into implementation mode, before you try the top 10 tips suggested to you on BuzzFeed or HBR or Forbes, one thing I do want you to think about is this third big idea. Like individuals, different teams are going to have different strengths, different development areas and challenges. So it's all the more important to get real practical feedback about your team from your team so that you can focus how you actually go ahead and support and develop them. So it really comes back to best practice at the end of the day. Not every strategy is going to be a one-size-fits-all. So before moving to action, get an accurate diagnosis. And one way we know we support individuals, and those of you in the HR talent, people and culture space know this well, is capturing data that helps us identify what they do well and what they need improvement on is so critical. Having something to actually objectively talk to and address. So how do we do that? Well, at the individual level, we use psychometric assessments, personality. We also use 360 feedback to get perspectives from the stakeholders that work closely with the individuals. So my question to you here as a leader, as a HR partner, as a consultant, as a coach, is how are you actually determining what your now newly remote team needs? We spoke earlier that yes, there are these 12 characteristics that underpin high performance and culture of those high performing teams, but not every team is going to have the same challenges, is going to have the same strengths, is going to demonstrate those characteristics equally. So what are you doing to actually get that objective data up front before you move to action? So when it comes to gathering feedback, gathering honest and practical feedback can be challenging at the best of times, right? We've all had teams or even individuals where we want that feedback, we want to know what's going on, but for whatever reason, there's a hesitance there to provide that feedback. It could be a cultural element, a culture within the organization where we don't, give that feedback openly unless asked. And even when we are asked, there's a whole range of politics at play that might prevent some really honest communication there. So one suggestion from us is that an effective way to encourage that feedback is to create some safety around that, create a little bit more anonymity. And this can actually allow, some of the more reserved individuals who typically haven't been open in speaking their mind or commenting on how the team is functioning at the moment, to have their say. And yes, your teams may have only just started working remotely over the last few weeks or months, but remote working teams and this way of working is not going away. If anything, I think this has opened a huge Pandora's box potentially for a lot of organizations in understanding, well, we can't let remote work just happen to us anymore. We need to get more proactive in how we better support our team and manage the performance there appropriately. So it may not be now, but you may find that over the next week, over the next month, there are going to be issues that arise from your team members. There are going to be things that maybe weren't impacting on the performance or the culture of your usually high performing teams that are now actually getting in the way. So how are you going to get some of that feedback in real time so that you can adjust your strategy as a leader, so you can address the way that you support these teams so that they continue to function in the best possible way? So the question here, how will you gather meaningful, practical feedback from your team? So one way that PBC has helped clients do this is through the high performing team assessment, and it's actually this is where the model of a high performing team is embedded. So we've conducted a range of research around, well, what are those factors that drive high performance? And in all reality, our clients up until this point have been using this primarily in traditional face-to-face teams, but more and more what we're seeing is obviously an appetite to understand, well, what is that performance looking like in the new world? So really very quickly, I think the benefits of something like this is that it gives you some clear metrics for measuring what the current team's performance and culture looks like. And as a science practitioner and as a psychologist, I think data is so critical and so important in making informed decisions that then translate to practical actions and outcomes. So being able to leverage data that support those actions is going to better support your team. I think it's also important to be able to benchmark how that team is performing in relation to other teams. And when used in conjunction with other data, so personality, for example, this is where you can get really sophisticated in terms of not just understanding how the team is operating in terms of these performance and culture characteristics, but then also understanding, well, how do individual personality styles, preferences and behaviors feed into the sort of culture that is now arising, or feed into the characteristics that drive performance in your newly remote teams. And at the end of the day, being able to track changes in performance in culture is so critical. And so this is a way to capture that information up front, gather the data, make an informed decision. Then you might go, right, if change readiness is an issue, or we know that trust and communication is an issue and we've got the data here to support that and it's what our team is crying out for, then we can move to, well, who in our sphere of influence can we look to help support in driving some actions towards that? Maybe that's when you go to Forbes, HBR, or various other media to absorb some of those practical tips. But I think today it was really about challenging some of the temptation there to jump immediately into those top tips, to think a little bit more strategically and a little bit more purposely around what you do, and then tracking the benefit of some of those practical actions over time. And that way you're getting this sort of return on investment, right? I'm able to see, well, this action has resulted in an improvement around our trust, but our communication hasn't improved as a result. So what needs to change here? Everything looks like it's going fine now. We're improving in a lot of areas, but we're seeing that the resilience of our team is taking a little bit of a hit over the last 6 months. So what now can I do to address that in a direct way? So just some very last key thoughts with regards to today's session. What should you consider? What should you take away from today in our thoughts? Remembering that the characteristics that underpin any sort of high performing team are the same for traditional and face-to-face teams as they are for your newly remote or virtual teams. It's just how those characteristics are demonstrated that are going to change. The capacity of your team to demonstrate the behaviors and characteristics associated with that high performance may have changed and may be very different now. And some factors associated with team functioning are likely to be more impacted by the change to remote working conditions than others. So whilst we highlighted, the big four or four characteristics that would likely be impacted, there's nothing to say that there are going to be other factors that are more impacted than others in your specific teams. So please resist the temptation just to move to an immediate top tips approach when supporting your teams. Gather data, do your due diligence to better understand how your team is currently functioning by getting feedback about the team from the team in an anonymous way, in a safe way, in a way that allows them to have that say in a really transparent manner. And obviously we can help with doing that. And then finally, use that data to inform where you target your support and your efforts as a leader. But above all, make sure you've got your technological hygiene factors in place. If your computer doesn't work, if your internet doesn't work, if there isn't the software in place, then a lot of this is going to fly, is not going to fly particularly well no matter what you do. So get those hygiene factors in place, make sure that the infrastructure is there for your teams to work in the situations that they're in at the moment. But once that's there, it is really about applying the same approach that we take towards developing our individuals, developing our leaders, but just really applying that to a team dynamic. So look, that's really all I had for today. Hopefully it's jump-started some thinking for you in terms of how you strategically approach the way that you support your remote teams moving forward. But I'd probably say now is a good time to take any questions, and Georgia, if there's been anything that's popped up in the chat, let me know.
Yep, thanks for that. So first up, for Justin, he asks, do you have any suggestions for ways teams can surface healthy conflict and encourage free flow of ideas when working remotely?
Yeah, really good question. And we saw professional conflict there as one of those underlying components of what high-performing teams do. In our context and in some of the clients that we've worked with, creating that psychologically safe culture and environment is so critical at the outset. I don't think you're going to get any sort of honest feedback in an environment where there is a fear of delivering that up the chain. I think then it really becomes a matter of setting that tone and culture from the leaders. A lot of this stuff is unspoken in terms of what we're allowed to say, who we say it to, when we approach things, how often we give feedback, what that feedback looks like. So driving that sort of culture from the top is important. Now that's easier said than done. And not to go into product plugging mode, but I think at the end of the day, understanding people's style, the way that they deal with conflict in a personal way is going to be important. So things like personality and understanding their behaviors and their styles and their values is going to be really critical in understanding, well, how do you approach conflict? How does our senior leadership team, typically, given their natural tendencies, approach difficult conversations, provide feedback, or engage in conflict? If you've got a team of leaders or SLTs who are reserved, who are uncommunicative by nature, then that's something that needs to be addressed first before you open up those channels around, well, let's put a strategy in place to how we communicate, because unless they've developed internally and individually those strategies to manage their style of communication, it's going to be all the more challenging to create a culture where it's okay and appropriate to do so. I hope that answered your question to some degree.
Yep, next up, Anne Stanton has asked, how does this apply to less traditional team structures? For example, project-based teams or agile teams?
Yeah, really great question. We've actually used this model across agile teams as well as manager or executive level teams. Those agile environments are where you might want to focus more around things like the innovation and change readiness, because they become a lot more prominent and important in those situations where people need to adapt, innovate, think differently, make those quicker decisions. And so, yes, there are components here, but obviously, given a specific disruptive agile environment, you may want to also consider things like getting specific feedback around agile qualities. There's a little bit of there in this model, but I would say that this is more of a balanced model across broader teams, but by no means does that mean that it's unapplicable to a virtual or projects-based team. What you may find in that situation is that you can use something like this as a pulse checker, right? So, the forming of the team after a few weeks or a month, depending on the length of the project, getting some of that feedback. How are we doing? What does the communication look like? What's the trust there? How well are we building those relationships? Then you might hit it again, midway through the project to see if that has been improved as a result of initiatives or strategies being put in place. And then again, toward the end of the close of that project, just before the team separates, how are we now? How we function better? Is there anything that we can take to our next project and our next dynamic so that we can apply it for our new project?
Yep. Next up, what advice do you have for those of us supporting teams that need real-life feedback but can't access tools like the HPTA due to budget constraints?
Yeah, look, it's a real it's a real factor, right? Belts are being a lot more tightened these days. I'd say that using this model, and this model is yes, it's governed by our research, but I think, as long as you take the methodology forward, then that's going to be critical. Now, the way that you gather that feedback may be through pulse surveying. So if you think about what you might do from an engagement perspective at an organizational level, there's nothing stopping you by doing that at a team level. The only thing to watch out for here is that the basis of something like the HPTA is really the members of that team commenting on the team's functioning, not commenting on the organization or other individuals. So this is not I'm giving you feedback as a 360 because I don't like what you did there, but more so around, as a team, when I reflect on what we've been doing over the last few months and how we've been operating, what is my perspective? So you can absolutely do that. Obviously, the challenges there are collating all of that benchmarking and aggregating all of that data. It's a little bit more effort if you're going to start it from scratch, but no reason why you can't. I suppose the HPTA was derived and developed to address that particular issue, so that a lot of that grunt work's been done there. It's backed by research, there's benchmark data, and so it becomes a lot easier to implement and report out and then facilitate and debrief off of.
Yeah, next up, Alex has asked, do you have a view on whether the steps for supporting your team can be broken into short, medium, or long term? That is, the things we should act on now versus those things that we will need to consider if this environment persists past 6 months or longer.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it just comes back down to best practice when it comes to developing strategy. I think any good business plan before COVID-19, post COVID-19, and during COVID-19, any good business plan is going to have what are the short-term plans here, and it might not be a 1 to 2 year plan. It might be a 3 to 6 month plan. It might be a 30-day to 60-day plan, but addressing some of those and having those things in play is important in capturing. But I think absolutely critical to continue the step out approach where you've got the short term, the medium term, and the long term. Those longer term and medium terms are maybe more likely to change and evolve as situations change. But I think that is best practice to have those various horizons so that at the end of the day, that strategy piece is still intact. That at the end of the day, the team, the individuals, the organizations knows exactly what their purpose is and what they're here for. And that purpose may change for the long run. If a situation like this persists for longer than is expected, then the purpose of that organization, what they want to achieve, the direction that they're heading is potentially going to change as well. So capturing that on an ongoing short, medium, long-term basis is absolutely critical. So I would say that is definitely advocate for that approach.
And Justin has asked, how honest should a leader be in sharing their emotions and vulnerability to their team? Is there a risk of panicking the team, or should we be radically open?
That is a huge question, and I think it will come back down to, Justin, the maturity of the organization and the team itself, because you're absolutely right. In an environment where that traditionally hasn't been done, and you've got leaders then just sharing everything, that can create a bit of panic, right? It can create because it's something that they're not used to. So this is really coming down to what is the culture of your organization at the moment. So when you look at something like the HPTA or any sort of diagnostic tools, getting what the current landscape looks like will give you an indication of the maturity in which leaders may be able to demonstrate some of these more vulnerable qualities. Now, when we look at the research, trust is associated with that vulnerability. So if trust is such an inherent part of what makes teams work, as well as a factor that can disrupt the function of a team if it's not there, then being open, being vulnerable, being transparent and honest is so critical in building that trust. But the way that it is done will need to be managed appropriately given the landscape and the context of your team and the culture there. Again, best practice I would say is don't guess. Don't take an intuitive approach to wanting to understand whether that is going to work or not work. Gather some data, get a feel for the climate of the team, get a feel for how it's functioning, so that you can make an informed decision of whether to advocate for that or even provide the necessary initiatives, training and development opportunities to address those in the right way.
I think that was our last question.
Okay. No worries. So a few things before we wrap up for this afternoon. Firstly, I just want to thank everybody who's taken the time out of their day to attend today's webinar. It is a new thing for us as well to be running something like this. So thank you for your support and your interest. And it just means that we've got so many more things that we can kind of bring out and sort of involve you with and keep you up to date on. So appreciate that. A few things in terms of some future webinars and qualifications next Wednesday. So Wednesday, the 8th of April, if this webinar or this thought session has sparked some interest in maybe getting across a diagnostic like the HPTA, we are offering a complimentary qualification on our channels. So next Wednesday, I believe it's about the same time at 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, we'll be conducting a formal HPTA qualification session. So off the back of that, you will actually be certified and qualified to use this tool in your teams or to support your clients. So we'd love to see you there. But that's pretty much all I had to say for this afternoon. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope everybody took at least something away to challenge their thoughts and their reflections about how to support their teams. We will be following up. If you have any other questions with regards to the content or the concepts that were discussed today, our team would love to connect and talk to you further. So feel free to reach out to us. But we'll be providing some information off the back of the session today. But otherwise, sorry.
Sorry, just to add to that, the HPTA qualification session will also include a complimentary HPTA for your team.
How good is that? So that question around budget is an opportunity to get a little creative around the budgetary constraints. So hopefully you can take advantage of that. Thanks, Jaja. Was there anything else that I missed before we wrap up for today?
No, it looks like we're all good. Thank you.
All right. Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and hopefully we'll see you at some future sessions. Bye.